Captain Marcus Webb had commanded soldiers for 21 years. He had signed deployment orders, written condolence letters, and stood at gravesides in full dress uniform while families fell apart in front of him. He had made hard decisions under fire in the dark, with incomplete information and no good options available. He had lived with those decisions. He had learned over 2 decades to sleep beside them, the way you learn to sleep beside anything that was permanent and unresolvable. But there was one morning he could not stop returning to. One sentence spoken quietly in a briefing room by a 28-year-old specialist from Austin, Texas, that he had dismissed the way you dismiss something that inconvenienced an already formed conclusion. He had set it aside. He had moved past it. He had continued the briefing with the brisk confidence of a man who had been right enough times to trust his own judgment, even when his judgment deserved to be questioned. He would spend the rest of his life wishing he had stopped, wishing he had looked at her properly, wishing he had said the words that came so easily in every version of that morning. He later replayed, "Tell me more. Walk me through it. What are you seeing that I am not seeing?" He never said those words. Everything that followed is the reason this story exists. The sun came up over Fallujah the way it always did in November. Slow at first, then sudden the darkness pulling back from the rooftops and the minarets and the long, flat stretch of desert beyond the eastern edge of the city. By 6 in the morning, the sky was already a hard, clear blue that made the city look almost peaceful from a distance. The kind of blue that had no business being above a place like this. Sarah Calloway had been awake since 4. She sat on an overturned ammunition crate outside the motor pool with her medical bag open across her knees, going through it for the 3rd time. Bandages arranged in the order she would need them. Tourniquets, 3 of them positioned where her hands could find them without looking. Hemostatic gauze, saline, decompression needles. A surgical airway kit she had never needed to use and hoped every morning she would never have to. Her hands moved through the bag the way a musician's hands moved across an instrument before a performance. Not checking anymore, not exactly. Just touching, making sure everything was still real. A voice came from the direction of the vehicles. "Calloway, that's the 3rd time." She didn't look up. "I know." Private Brennan Kowalski leaned against the hood of the 2nd MRAP with his arms folded, watching her with the particular grin of a 22-year-old who had not yet learned to be afraid of the right things. He was tall and lean from Columbus, Ohio, with a laugh that carried across a motor pool and a habit of filling silence with words. Most of the time, Sarah appreciated that about him. "You checked it before you went to sleep," he said. "You checked it when you woke up." "And I'll check it again before we roll," she said. "Go away, Kowalski." He pushed off the hood and walked toward her, pulling a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket with the careful reverence of someone handling something fragile. He unfolded it and held it in front of her. A plane ticket. Columbus, Ohio. The departure time was 72 hours from now. "You see this," he said. "This is a real piece of paper with a real departure time. I have 72 hours left in this country, and I intend to spend all of them not getting shot." Sarah looked at the ticket, then at him. "Then stop talking to me and start paying attention today," she said. He folded the ticket back into his pocket with both hands, carefully, the way you returned something irreplaceable to its place. His grin didn't disappear, but it changed, became quieter, became something he was wearing rather than something that was simply happening to his face. "I always pay attention," he said. "I just don't make it look like work." He walked back toward the vehicle. Sarah watched him go, then looked down at her bag and went through it a 4th time. Sergeant Douglas Harrett was 34 years old and had the particular quality of a man who had decided a long time ago that nothing was going to surprise him. He had the build of someone who had been carrying heavy things for most of his life, and the unhurried movement that came from 12 years of service and 2 combat deployments. He had been in places worse than this, done things harder than this, and had come out the other side with a settled groundedness that newer soldiers sometimes mistook for indifference. It was not indifference, it was the opposite of indifference. It was the specific quality of a man who cared very much about a great number of things and had learned to carry that caring without showing it to everyone. That morning, he was sitting in the driver's seat of the lead vehicle with the door open and his feet on the running board, looking at a photograph, small, slightly out of focus, printed at a drugstore somewhere between here and home. A baby girl 6 days old, wrapped in a yellow blanket, squinting at a camera she could not yet understand. She had her mother's nose. She had Harriet's eyes. He had not been there when she was born. He had been here. He had received the news through a satellite call that dropped twice and came back through static, and afterward he had sat in this same vehicle, in this same motor pool, and looked at his hands for a long time without moving. He pressed the photograph against the dashboard panel to the left of the steering column, smoothed its edges, and sat looking at it for a moment. Then he picked up his gloves and began putting them on. Sarah came past the front of the vehicle with her bag over her shoulder. She slowed when she saw the photograph. Harriet looked at her. 6 days ago, he said. She's beautiful, Sarah said. She is. He kept his eyes on the photograph a moment longer. Her mother says she's loud. She'll figure out when to be loud and when to be quiet, Sarah said. Give her time. Harriet almost smiled. You say that like you know. I know enough. She adjusted the bag. You're home after this rotation, right? 3 weeks. Keep that in mind today, she said. She walked toward the briefing room. Harriet looked at the photograph one more time. Then he pulled the door closed and stared through the windshield at the empty street beyond the gate. 3 weeks. The briefing room was a converted storage space with folding tables and a whiteboard that had never been fully erased. Maps were taped to the walls at slightly different angles, overlapping in places, their edges curling in the dry heat. 12 soldiers sat in 2 uneven rows of folding chairs. Captain Marcus Webb stood at the front. Webb was 44, Virginia-born, with 20 years of service behind him, and the kind of face that showed exactly as much as it intended to show, and nothing more. He was not a large man, but he had a stillness that took up space, a quality of settled authority that people registered without being told to register it. When he spoke, people listened. He had, by every measure the Army possessed, done his job correctly for 2 decades. He was going to have to live the rest of his life knowing that none of that mattered on this particular morning. He ran the briefing the way he always did. Objective, a residential compound on the eastern edge of the city, suspected weapons cache, 2nd floor. Route north on Route Henry to Checkpoint 4 east through the residential sector. 3 vehicles, 12 personnel. Estimated time to objective 14 minutes. Return to base before afternoon heat. The intelligence package was thorough, more than thorough. It included thermal imaging from an aerial pass 48 hours prior, a compound layout with measurements, a summary of local police coordination, confirmation of Iraqi police security assurances along the route, a notation of reduced insurgent activity in the sector over the preceding 3 weeks. As clean a picture as they were going to get. Webb said exactly that. He asked if there were questions. Sarah Calloway raised her hand. The intel package, she said. The imagery, the route, confirmation, the police coordination. It's all there, done. That's correct, Webb said. There are no gaps in it. Webb waited. In 8 months of reading these packages, she said, I've never seen one without gaps. The camera misses a window. The police liaison gets bad information from someone further down the chain. Something doesn't line up exactly. It's always something. But this package has no gaps at all. Every piece confirms every other piece. It's completely consistent. Silence in the room. That's generally considered a good thing, Calloway, Webb said. Yes, sir. Her voice was level, unhurried. Except I've never seen it. Not on a Fallujah block. Not once in 8 months. What you're telling me, he said, is that you're concerned because the intelligence is too good. I'm telling you it looks like something we're supposed to see, she said. A picture someone wanted us to find. Webb held her gaze. Around the room, 12 soldiers sat very still. I appreciate the analysis specialist, he said. We roll at 0845. Any other questions? There were no other questions. Sarah looked at the map on the wall for a moment longer. Then she looked down at her hands. She did not say anything to anyone as they walked back to the vehicles. She stood beside the second MRAP in the early morning light and went through her medical bag one more time. Tourniquets, bandages, hemostatic gauze, everything where her hands could find it. Kowalski climbed past her into the rear of the vehicle and bumped her shoulder on the way up. For what it's worth, he said quietly. I thought you made a good point in there. She looked up at him for a moment. Get in the vehicle, Kowalski, she said. He got in. She closed the bag and climbed in after him. In the front seat of the lead vehicle, Harriet started the engine. On the dashboard panel, the photograph of his daughter shifted slightly in the vibration. The gate opened. 3 vehicles moved out into the morning street in single file. The city swallowed them. Fallujah in November had a particular quality to its mornings. The heat had not yet arrived in full force, and the streets carried a kind of provisional quiet the way a theater felt before the performance began. Ordinary life moved through those streets with the practiced casualness of people who had learned to exist inside uncertainty without being consumed by it. Children in school uniforms moved in small clusters toward a building 2 blocks north. A man in a white dishdasha pushed a cart loaded with flatbread, the steam rising pale against the morning air. Three older men sat outside a tea house, their conversation unhurried, their gestures slow. Sarah watched all of this through the small, scratched window of the MRAP's rear compartment. She had seen it on every patrol across 8 months, the ordinary life that continued alongside everything else, indifferent to it or exhausted by it or simply too necessary to stop. She had learned in those 8 months to read what was ordinary and what was not. She noticed that the side streets were empty, every side street visible through the window, every narrow passage between buildings, every connecting alley as if someone had arranged for the ordinary life to be present on the main road and absent everywhere adjacent to it. It was a small thing, the kind of thing that could mean nothing. She sat with it for a moment and watched the streets continue to be empty. The convoy slowed as it turned onto the final approach. The target compound was visible ahead, 2 stories of pale concrete behind a low wall, exactly matching the imagery in the briefing package. Webb's voice came through the radio, calm professional, running through the final assignments. Sarah checked her bag. Her hands were steady. The explosion came from under the lead vehicle. It came without warning, without the sound that sometimes preceded it. One moment the convoy was moving at walking pace toward the compound gate. The next moment there was a force that arrived before the noise, before the light, before the understanding of what had happened. The lead MRAP lifted off the ground. In the fraction of a second before Sarah's vision went white with the blast, she saw the vehicle rise its front end higher than its rear, moving in a way that vehicles were not designed to move. Then the light took everything. The second vehicle rocked hard on its suspension from the shockwave. Sarah felt it through the floor, through the seats, through the metal frame around her. The windows held. The armor held. But the world outside had changed completely and irrevocably in the space of a single second. Then the firing started. It came from multiple directions simultaneously, the way it came when something had been planned in advance by people who knew precisely what they were doing. From windows on the north side of the street, from rooftops to the east, from a ground-level position in a building to the west that had appeared in every aerial photograph to be unoccupied. The sound was total, surrounding the specific chaos of an engagement that had been designed rather than spontaneous. Webb's voice on the radio was immediate. Contact, contact, contact. Multiple directions. All elements establish cover. Calloway, I need eyes on the lead vehicle. Sarah was already moving. She pushed the rear door open and stepped down into the street. The noise came at her all at once. The crack of incoming rounds, the heavier concussion of outgoing fire from the surviving vehicles, the voices of soldiers calling positions, the sound of debris still settling from the initial explosion. Smoke moved across the street in the morning air, white and gray and acrid. The lead vehicle was on its side 30 meters ahead. The blast had rolled it completely. It lay against the compound wall with its undercarriage exposed. Armor plates intact, but the whole structure wrong. A piece of equipment transformed into an obstacle. Somewhere inside it there were people. She ran. She ran low, her bag against her hip, rounds impacting on the road surface around her in small explosions of grit and dust. She could hear Webb calling. Positions could hear Thurston returning fire from behind the second vehicle, could hear voices in Arabic from the buildings to the north. She reached the lead vehicle and pressed herself against its hull. The metal was hot from the blast. Movement from inside. A voice low and pained calling out. She moved around to the rear of the overturned vehicle where the door was wedged partially accessible against the compound wall. She got her fingers into the gap and pulled. Harriet, can you hear me? A sound from inside. Not words. Breath. She pulled harder. The door gave 2 inches, grinding against the concrete. She got her forearm into the gap and pushed with her shoulder. The door moved 4 more inches. Through the gap, she could see Harriet, suspended at an angle seatbelt, still locked, one arm hanging loose in a way that arms did not hang when all the bones inside them were intact. Blood on his face from a laceration above his eye, dark and moving slowly. But his eyes were open and they found her face through the gap. Calloway, he said, something compressed in his voice, something she noted and filed. I'm here, she said. I'm going to get you out. Are you with me? Webb, he said. Where's Webb? Webb is on the radio, establishing cover. Are you with me, Harriet? A long breath. Yeah, I'm with you. She'd pulled the door. The first bullet hit her in the right shoulder. It arrived as physical shock before it arrived as pain, a rotation she hadn't chosen, the force that spun her left shoulder forward and knocked her hand off the handle. She hit the side of the vehicle and caught it, her fingers finding a seam in the armor plating, and held herself upright for 3 full seconds through pure refusal before her legs cooperated. The pain came after. She registered it and moved past it. She understood in the portion of her mind that remained clinical, regardless of what the rest of her was doing, that the shoulder wound needed addressing. Later, not now, she pulled the door. 6 inches 8. She got her boot against the vehicle frame and pushed while she pulled, using her whole body as a lever, and the door swung open far enough for a person to fit through. Harriet, unclip your belt and come toward the door. Belt's jammed. I'm coming in. The interior of the overturned vehicle was a rearranged world. Everything that had been floor now wall, the seats at wrong angles, equipment scattered. She found the buckle of Harriet's seatbelt by feel and worked it until it released. He came loose and she caught him, her shoulder sending a signal she acknowledged and set aside, and she moved him toward the door with the careful efficiency of someone doing a task that training had made automatic. She got him out, got him behind the vehicle in the partial cover between the hull and the compound wall, opened her bag, and went to work. The second bullet hit her in the left leg. This one dropped her. Her knee hit the ground, and for a moment the street tilted. She looked down. Her hand went to the wound by itself the way trained hands moved. She pressed. Harriet watched her from where she had placed him against the wall. Calloway, he said. Head laceration on you is superficial, she said. Arm is going to need imaging, possible radius fracture. Can you stay conscious? He looked at her leg, at the blood on her hand. Can you bear? Fair question. She looked at the street. Through the smoke, she could see the second and third vehicles holding position, returning fire. She could see Webb's shape behind a section of concrete wall further down the street, cut off by open ground. She could see Kowalski. He had dismounted in the chaos. He was lying in the street 15 meters away, in the open on his side, not moving. The way he was lying was wrong. The angle of his left leg was wrong. His ticket was 72 hours from now. She looked at Harriet. Stay low, behind the vehicle. Do not move. She picked up her bag. I'm going to get Kowalski. Harriet reached out and took her arm. His grip was strong, despite the possible fracture. You've been hit twice, he said. I know. Calloway. I know, Harriet. She looked at Kowalski in the street. He's 22 years old and he has a plane ticket home. Harriet held her arm for one more second. Then he let go. She ran. Webb saw her from behind the concrete wall. He saw her run from cover into the open street, her left leg moving wrong, her bag swinging, heading toward Kowalski's position with rounds impacting the road around her. He tried to raise her on the radio. He couldn't. He tried to move his element to her position. The volume of fire from the north building made it impossible. He was a capable officer with 20 years of experience, and he was completely helpless. The Iraqi liaison who had provided the intelligence package was crouched 3 meters from Webb's position, trying to make himself small against the wall. Webb had registered him without focusing on him for the first minutes of the engagement. Now he looked at him. The man's eyes were moving in a way that Webb recognized from 20 years of reading people. Not the wide-open stillness of fear. Something calculating. Something that was tracking the engagement rather than fleeing from it. Webb grabbed the man by the collar. In the man's jacket was a handheld radio. Compact, military grade. When Webb looked at the frequency setting, everything in his chest dropped at once. It was their frequency. The man had been transmitting their position from the moment the convoy left the gate. Their vehicle count, their approach route, every checkpoint, every adjustment. It had all gone somewhere to someone who had been waiting for this specific convoy on this specific street at this specific time. The intelligence package had not been gathered through weeks of patient work. It had been written. Every confirmation, every aerial image, every police coordination note had been placed to create a single coherent picture of normalcy on a street that had been prepared as a killing ground. Webb secured the radio. He turned to Paulson beside him. Get me a line to battalion, now, every piece of cover fire we have on that north building. But in the portion of his mind that was not running the tactical response, he was standing in a briefing room watching a 28-year-old specialist from Texas raise her hand and tell him the truth in plain language. Intel this clean on a Fallujah block doesn't happen. She had been right. She had been standing directly in front of him, telling him the truth, and he had set it aside and moved on and sent 12 soldiers into a trap that had been months in the making. And now the best of those soldiers was crossing an open street on 2 bullet wounds because a 22-year-old boy from Columbus needed a medic. Webb got on the radio and did not stop working it for the next 40 hours. The third bullet and the fourth came within seconds of each other. Sarah was behind Kowalski, by then her hands already on his leg, when she felt the impact in her lower back and then the graze across the top of her skull that knocked her face first onto the road surface. She pressed her palms against the asphalt and stayed there. The world became very loud, then very quiet. Then it came back, sound and light together, the crack of rifles and the smell of cordite and the hot surface of the road under her hands. She pushed herself up. Kowalski was looking at her. His face was pale. His left leg was fractured in at least two places, the lower section at an angle that required no x-ray to confirm. Blood loss from the compound fracture was significant and proceeding. He was conscious. He was watching her. "You're hit," he said. "You're worse," she said. She opened her bag and her hands moved through it with the certainty of someone who had checked its contents 4 times that morning and knew where everything was in the dark, in the smoke, in whatever conditions the situation produced. Tourniquet, 4 inches above the fracture. She placed it and tightened it and watched his face while she worked. His face told her it was working. She looked at the street. The smoke had thickened. The firing had settled into a rhythm now organized and patient, the rhythm of people directing an engagement rather than reacting to one. This had been planned for weeks. The empty side streets, the spotless intelligence, the coordinated fire from positions that had been established in waiting before the convoy left the gate that morning. She thought about the briefing room for exactly the time it took her to reach that conclusion. Then she stopped thinking about it and dragged Kowalski toward the partial cover of the overturned vehicle. She moved him in short pulls across the road surface using her legs and her right arm, each pull sending something through her left leg that she categorized and set aside. By the time she reached the vehicle's shadow, she was breathing hard and deliberately, and her medical bag had taken shrapnel from a round that hit the asphalt 3 feet to her left. She checked the tourniquet on Kowalski, checked Harriet's pressure bandage. Both men were alive. She pressed her back against the overturned vehicle and looked at the sky. That hard, clear blue. That impossible blue that had no business being above a place like this, continuing its indifferent business regardless of what was happening in the city beneath it. She thought about her father, the photograph in her wallet, the man in the service uniform, taken the year before she was born, the year before the Korean War wound, that had stayed in his left knee for the rest of his life. She had joined the army because of him, because of the way he had talked about service on the few evenings she could remember clearly, the way he made it sound like something that meant something beyond the individual who performed it. She had not understood then that what he carried was this specific weight, a street in a foreign city with people depending on you and no good options and no one coming yet. She understood it now. She checked her shoulder, still bleeding but controlled. She checked her leg, tourniquet needed, not yet critical. She checked the graze at the back of her skull with her fingertips and found it exactly what it had felt like, significant pain, not incapacitating. She picked up her bag and went back to work. The afternoon came in force. The sun climbed to its position directly overhead and pressed down with a weight that was almost physical, finding every gap in body armor, every exposed inch of skin, every shadow that had offered shelter in the morning hours, and now offered nothing. Sarah Calloway had been behind the overturned vehicle for 4 hours. The rhythm of the firefight had established itself, surging and receding, the insurgents probing for a response, pulling back when return fire from the surviving vehicles intensified, then probing again from a slightly different angle. Methodical, patient, the rhythm of people who understood that time was on their side. She understood it too. Harriet was conscious in and out, his broken arm immobilized against his chest with a sling made from her undershirt sleeve. The head laceration had stopped bleeding. His color was not good, but it wasn't worsening. She checked his pupils every 30 minutes and wrote the times on the back of her left hand in permanent marker, because the notebook in her bag had taken water damage from the ruptured saline pack. Kowalski had not lost consciousness since she reached him. This was partly good news and partly a function of his pain, which was significant enough to keep him from drifting. She had secured the tourniquet above the fracture and checked it at intervals measured by counting her own breaths. She had splinted the leg with the rigid components from her bag and an antenna housing pulled from the vehicle debris. He had gone quiet in the past hour. She checked him, adjusted his position, spoke to him. At one point, he looked at her for a long moment and said, "You were right this morning, in the briefing." She kept her eyes on the tourniquet she was checking. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "It matters that you saw it," he said. She moved to check his pulse. It was weak but present. She did not respond because there was nothing to add, and the pulse needed monitoring, and those were the two relevant facts. She was thinking about the side streets. She had been thinking about them since the first explosion. The particular arrangement of ordinary life on the main road and nothing on the streets adjacent to it. Someone had studied this convoy and this route and built a situation designed to be entered and then closed. The intelligence package had not been gathered. It had been authored. She had known this, or as close to knowing as intuition came in the briefing room. She had said it in the plainest language she could find. She had watched it be set aside. She was not angry. Anger was not useful. She filed it alongside the shoulder wound and the leg wound and the graze across her skull in the category of things that existed and were real and would require addressing at a time that was not right now. Right now, two men were alive and needed to remain that way. That was the inventory. That was the work. Webb's voice on the radio had been consistent throughout the afternoon. Not frequent, not chatty, but steady. Position reports coordinated return fire backup requests through the battalion network. He had not spoken directly to Sarah since the first hour when her radio took damage. He had confirmed her position through the reports of other soldiers who had eyes on the vehicle. She was there. She was moving. He chose to hold those two facts as the only version of the situation he was willing to operate within. At 14:20, the sound of rotors came from the northwest. The specific percussion of an Army medevac helicopter. The sound that had acquired enormous significance over months in country, a sound that meant the sealed world of an engagement was being opened from outside. Webb heard it and felt for the first time in hours something adjacent to hope. He watched the UH-60 appear over the roofline coming in at speed, the pilot making an approach at an altitude that communicated everything necessary about what they understood the threat environment to be. The aircraft was 200 meters out when the RPG came from the eastern rooftop. The round passed close enough that the pilot broke the approach immediately and violently pulling the nose up and banking hard to the south, the aircraft climbing and accelerating away from the engagement zone with the speed of something that had just understood how close it had come. In 10 seconds, it was beyond the roofline. In 30 seconds, the sound was gone. Webb looked at the sky where it had been. Paulson said nothing. There was nothing to say. 18 hours minimum before another attempt. That was the calculation. That was what the clock said now. Webb got back on the radio. Sarah had heard the helicopter. She had heard the RPG. She had heard the helicopter leave. She registered all of it and returned to what she was doing. There was no useful response to the helicopter being gone. Its absence did not change the requirements of the next hour. Kowalski still needed his tourniquet checked. Harriet still needed monitoring for intracranial pressure. Sarah still needed to keep herself functional enough to do both of those things. She took stock. Shoulder bleeding slowed, wound packed with hemostatic gauze bandage tied off against the vehicle's grab handle for leverage. Through the deltoid, no arterial involvement. Left leg tourniquet maintaining wound in the lateral thigh deeper than she preferred, but the tourniquet was doing its work. Time management required. Head graze producing a low-grade headache she was choosing to interpret as a graze and nothing more. Cognition intact. Vision clear. Decisions proceeding in logical sequence. These were the relevant data points. She picked up her bag and moved to Kowalski. The afternoon wore toward evening with the slowness of hours that could not be hurried. The firing continued in its established rhythm. She listened to battalion-level traffic from the radio she had salvaged, from the lead vehicle debris receiving but not transmitting, tracking Webb's position reports without responding. The coordinates he gave told her he had not been able to move his element forward. The ground between his position and hers remained open and contested. He was 50 meters away. He might as well have been in Virginia. Night came at once the way desert nights arrived, darkness dropping over the city in the space of minutes, the temperature following immediately 20 degrees in the first hour, 30 in the second. The thermal arithmetic of the desert, which gave everything in the daytime and took everything back after dark. Sarah used the emergency thermal blanket from her bag to cover Kowalski, who was the most at risk from temperature fluctuation given his blood loss. She positioned herself between him and the wind coming off the open ground to the east. Inadequate preparation for a November desert night, and she knew it. It was what was available. Harriet slipped into unconsciousness around 2100, breathing regular pupils equal and reactive when she checked with the small tactical flashlight. Not deteriorating. Conserving. She checked Kowalski. He looked at her in the dark with eyes that were working hard to stay present. "Tell me something," he said. "What do you want to know?" "Anything. Tell me about Texas." She thought for a moment. "My mother runs a barbecue restaurant in Austin," she said. "Has since before I was born. My grandfather built the pit in the parking lot from cinder blocks and used the same wood for 30 years. Mesquite. You can smell it 3 blocks away on a good day." "What does she make?" "Brisket, ribs, sausage links from a butcher 2 streets over. On Sundays, she does turkey because my father liked turkey." She paused. "She still does it every Sunday, even now." Kowalski was quiet for a moment. Your dad's gone since I was 9. I'm sorry. He was a good man, she said. He served. I think about him sometimes on operations. I think about what he understood about this that I didn't understand when I was 9. What did he understand? She looked at the darkness beyond the vehicle. That everything real costs something, she said. He knew that, and he did it anyway. I think that's the definition of more than one thing. Kowalski was quiet again. Then my mom's going to be at the airport in Columbus, standing at the arrivals gate with a sign. She makes signs, big letters. He almost smiled. Embarrassing signs. What's the sign going to say? What? Welcome home, dummy. She always calls me dummy when she's happy to see me. That's a good sign, Sarah said. Yeah, he said. It is. She checked his tourniquet. The 5th bullet came at 22:40. She had moved from behind the vehicle to check a position further south along the hull, a calculated risk to assess the status of the street. The round came from the north building and hit her left forearm, the radius specifically, and the bone gave way with a sound she felt more than heard. Her left arm went numb from elbow to fingertips. She pulled back behind the vehicle and gave herself 10 seconds. Not to wait, to process. To feel the full magnitude of it completely, and then stop feeling it and start managing it. 10 seconds was the allocation. When the 10 seconds were over, she began immobilizing the fracture with her right hand and her teeth for the knots, a process that took 4 minutes and required more precision than the pain made reasonable. When she was done, she checked the knots with her right hand. They held. She went back to Kowalski and checked the tourniquet. Left arm non-functional, right arm intact. She would adapt. The adaptation was already underway. The 6th and 7th bullets came within seconds of each other at 23:50. She was moving between the two men carrying the section of salvaged antenna housing she had been using to prop Harriet's injured arm at an elevation that reduced swelling. The first round caught her in the chest. The body armor absorbed the bullet, but the impact force transferred through the plate, a blunt trauma that drove the air from her lungs and sent her staggering backward into the vehicle. She hit it and slid down it, her back against the hull, unable to hold her weight for approximately 3 seconds. The second round came while she was down. It passed through the lower back below the bottom edge of the armor plate on the left side. This one was different from the others, not only in the pain, which was significant, but in what came with it. Something had been changed in a way that could not be changed back. She could feel it in her breathing, which had acquired a reluctance, a tightening, as if her lungs were having a conversation with her that they had not been having before. She turned her head and looked at Kowalski. He was looking at her. His face in the near darkness was very still. Still here, she said. Her voice was smaller than she intended. He nodded slowly. She pushed herself upright. Everything else was a problem to be solved in sequence. She had the sequence. She went back to work. The 8th bullet arrived with the dawn. Morning of the second day, the sun separating itself from the horizon, the sky going from black to deep blue to a gray that would become gold within the hour. She had been awake for 26 continuous hours, tracking that number, not because it mattered in isolation, but because it helped her maintain a framework. Time as something sequential and therefore manageable rather than the suspended elastic thing it had begun to feel like. She was sitting with her back against the vehicle, her right hand on Kowalski's wrist, monitoring his pulse at regular intervals. The pulse was present, weak and thready, but present. She had been managing his tourniquet through the night, releasing and retightening at intervals to prevent irreversible tissue damage. Each retightening was an event. Each release was a calculation. He was alive because the math was still working. Harriet had regained consciousness 3 times during the night, briefly each time long enough to confirm his vision was clear and that he understood where he was. The 3rd time, just before dawn, he had looked at her with the particular expression of someone trying to memorize what they were seeing. How bad, he said. Manageable, she said. His eyes moved across her left arm, its improvised immobilization, the blood that had soaked through the chest area of her armor and dried there the way her whole body had reorganized itself around the compensations she was making without appearing to make them. He had been a soldier long enough to read what he was looking at. How many times, he said. She met his eyes. 7. He was quiet for a moment. Tell me about your daughter, she said. It worked the way she intended. His eyes moved away from her and towards something internal. She's got her mother's nose, he said. You told me that yesterday. I keep coming back to it. A long breath. I haven't held her yet. I've seen her in a photograph and I haven't held her. You're going to, Sarah said. 3 weeks. 3 weeks, she said. No. He looked at her again, and something had broken open in him quietly during the desert night, something she had not seen in Harriet's face across months of shared deployment and the daily proximity of people working close together under pressure. "You should have stayed in cover," he said. "You should have found a position and waited for extraction." "No," she said simply. "You've taken 7 rounds because you pulled me out of that vehicle. You do the same. Don't make it more than it is." He started to say something else, and she held up her right hand. "Harriet, go back to sleep." He did not argue. His eyes closed. His breathing settled into the slow rhythm of someone doing the work of healing. She turned back to Kowalski, checked his pulse, checked the tourniquet. The sun came up. The 8th bullet came from the eastern rooftop at 07:15, when the light was sufficient for a shooter with a good position to begin working again with confidence. It caught Sarah in the hip as she repositioned to get a better angle on Kowalski's wound site. The impact was specific and terrifying in a way the others had not been. Her left leg, already compromised by the thigh wound, simply ceased to function. Not pain, not weakness, absence. She went down hard, her hips striking the road surface, and lay there while the full weight of the morning's heat pressed down from above. She tried to move her left leg. Nothing happened. She tried again, concentrating, sending the signal deliberately. Nothing. She rolled onto her right side using her right arm as a lever, got her right knee under her, got herself into a partial kneeling position with one functional arm and one functional leg, which was less than she had started with yesterday morning and more than she needed to stop. She looked at Kowalski. He was watching her. His face had the expression of someone who had been watching something happen for a long time and had passed through fear and arrived somewhere raw. "I'm going to need to change your method of transport," she said. Her voice was steady because she made it steady. "I can't carry you. I'm going to have to drag. That's going to be uncomfortable." "You just got shot in the hip," he said. "I noticed. Your left leg isn't working." "Also noticed." She picked up her bag with her right arm. "If I stay put, you don't make it before extraction arrives." He stared at her. She moved. The 9th and 10th bullets came together at 07:53. She was pulling herself along the vehicle's length with her right arm and right leg dragging her left leg behind her. Slow work. She had covered 1 meter of the 3 she needed to cover when the 9th round came through her right shoulder, not the shoulder she had been using, the one functioning arm she had left. The full-body shutdown of it was immediate, every compensating system in her body recalibrating at once, looking for something to do the work with and finding less than it needed. The 10th came into her right side below the armor's coverage, and she went flat. Face against the road surface, the asphalt hot against her cheek. She could smell the city dust and smoke, and the particular smell of a street that had been fought over for 2 days, a smell that had no name. She lay still. Harriet's voice came from somewhere close. "Calloway." She heard it from a distance. "Calloway, answer me." She was working through the inventory. Right arm compromised but present. Right leg present. Left leg absent. Breathing present but labored. Vision present but narrowing at the edges. She had what she needed to continue. 17 minutes later, the 11th bullet came. She had counted her pulls across those 17 minutes, measuring distance by the number of times her right arm had reached forward and pulled each pull a unit of measurement when nothing else was available for measuring. 2 meters covered. 1 remained. The round came from the north building and struck the back of her head. What followed was not exactly unconsciousness. It was closer to a complete circuit interruption. She was present, and then she was not present, and then she was somewhere that was not the street and not anywhere identifiable, and then she was back. Face against the asphalt again. The sky above the vehicle's edge was the color of late morning. She had been here for 40 hours. Everything below her neck was a landscape she was receiving reports from rather than inhabiting. She could detect her right hand. She could detect the fingers of it. She could not determine their position relative to the ground without looking, so she turned her head slowly and looked. Her right hand was on the road surface, 6 inches in front of her face. There was a great deal of blood on the road surface. She looked at Kowalski, 1 meter away, looking at her with the expression of someone who had exhausted every category they had built for the world over 22 years of being inside it. His lips were moving. She listened. "Calloway," he was saying, barely audible. "Sarah, still there." She looked at him. She had a right hand. It was still moving. She started to crawl. There was no moment of decision. It was not a choice in any way that word usually applied. It was the thing that happened when everything else had been removed, and 2 facts remained. A man 1 meter away who was going to dump, and a hand that was still moving. She reached forward with her right hand. She pulled. She reached again. Behind her, she left a trail in the dust. Harriet, from his position against the vehicle, watched her cross that final meter. He had been a soldier for 12 years and had seen people do hard things in bad situations. He had done some of those things himself. He had believed entering that morning that he understood the full range of what a person could do when the situation required it. He had not understood. He tried to get up, no, twice. His body refused him both times. He could only watch. He watched her right hand reach Kowalski. He watched it find the tourniquet. He looked up at his daughter's photograph still pressed against the inside of the vehicle above him, tilted at an angle from the blast still there. Her name was not yet chosen. Her mother had left that for him. He had been considering names since the satellite call 6 days ago, running them through his head in quiet moments, and none of them had settled. He looked at his daughter's face in the photograph, and he watched Sarah Calloway's right hand working on Kowalski's tourniquet with the automatic precision of someone whose body remembered what to do, regardless of what the rest of the situation was doing. For the first time in 34 years of his life, Harriet cried. Not loudly, not in a way that would have been audible to anyone, but completely the way things came apart when they had been held together past their capacity. He lay back and looked at the hard blue sukiki. He thought he might have a name. The second night came in without ceremony. One moment there was a last thin line of orange along the western horizon, the specific color of a desert sunset that had no interest in being beautiful, but was anyway. Then the line was gone, and the sky went from gray to black in 10 minutes, and the temperature followed it down, dropping 20 degrees before the first hour was complete. Sarah Calloway had been on the ground for 40 hours. She was aware of this from a slight distance, as information arriving from somewhere outside herself rather than from within. The pain had changed in character over the past several hours. In the beginning, it had been specific, each of the 11 wounds distinct, each with its own location and signal. Now it had merged into something larger and less defined, a general condition of her body, rather than a collection of individual injuries. She had read about this in medical training. She noted it and continued. Kowalski's tourniquet had been managed through the late afternoon and into the evening with the right hand that was the last fully functional part of her. Checked at intervals, tracked by counting her own breaths. Released and retightened with the focus of someone doing precision work in a quiet room, not someone lying face down on a road in the dark, with 11 bullet wounds and core temperature dropping. Harriet was breathing. She could hear it. Slow and regular, the rhythm of someone doing the work of staying alive. Every 40 minutes or so, he spoke a few words, not always coherently, but enough to confirm that the signal was still coming through. She talked to both of them when she could make enough air for it. She told them about the mesquite smoke from her mother's restaurant and the way it reached you 3 blocks away before the building was visible. She told them about the drive north out of Austin on a clear morning, the hill country opening up around you as the city fell away. She told them about her father's voice, low and unhurried, no urgency in it except when it needed to have urgency, and then it had all the urgency in the world. She told them these things and was not certain how much they heard, and it did not matter. She was also telling herself. The sound of her own voice was information airway, still open, chest still moving, system still running. As long as she could speak, she could continue. At 2300, the fighting in the surrounding sectors reached a new intensity. Tank fire to the west. Apache rotors moving at speed beyond the roofline to the north. The percussion of a city-wide engagement that had consumed every available resource on both sides. She had understood this from the radio traffic throughout the day. Multiple units pinned multiple extraction requests, unmet the city, a system under enormous pressure, making decisions about resources based on calculations she was not in a position to argue with from her current location. She was on the list. She knew Webb had been putting her on the list every 30 minutes. She knew help was coming in the form of a calculation that was being worked through somewhere else by people who understood the full picture better than she could from behind an overturned vehicle in a contested street. She closed her eyes, not sleeping. She had learned the difference over 2 days between the pull toward unconsciousness that came from injury and blood loss, which she resisted, and the brief dimming that her brain required to continue functioning, which she permitted in small increments. Never more than a few minutes. Never without setting an internal condition that would bring her back. The condition was Kowalski's breathing. As long as she could hear it, she could let her eyes close. She heard it. She let them close. At 50 meters, Webb was running a calculation that had no solution. He had been running it for 40 hours. He needed to reach 3 soldiers behind an overturned vehicle 50 meters away. Between his position and theirs was open ground that had already cost 2 soldiers who had attempted to cross it at various points over the preceding day. The enemy had that ground covered from at least 3 confirmed positions and possibly more. Moving across it in daylight was an acceptable risk calculation only if you weighted survival near zero. Moving in darkness required suppressive fire he did not have the personnel to generate. He had 4 soldiers with him. 2 were wounded. All 4 were running on the last reserves of water and ammunition the vehicles had carried. He had been resupplied exactly once a drone drop at dusk on the first day, barely enough to extend their capacity by a few hours. He had done everything possible from where he was, called in the position continuously, provided corrections to the fire support officer that had allowed 2 artillery strikes against the north building, talked 3 rescue operations through planning phases, each one aborted by conditions outside anyone's control. He sat with his back against the wall in the second night's darkness and thought about a 28-year-old specialist from Austin who had raised her hand in a briefing room and told him the truth and whom he had dismissed like the information was inconvenient. Intel this clean on a Fallujah block doesn't happen. He thought about the Iraqi liaison and the radio set to their frequency. He thought about the weeks of work required to place exactly the right information in exactly the right hands to create a picture of perfect normalcy on a street prepared as a killing ground. He thought about what it cost to be right and be dismissed, to have the analysis and have it set aside, and then to be the person responsible for keeping everyone alive anyway. He did not think there was a word for that cost that did it justice. Paulson touched his arm. "Sir, radio." The voice on the other end was Lieutenant Commander Garrett Finch of Naval Special Warfare. 12 operators, 2 hours of darkness left a route that latest aerial reconnaissance suggested was viable. He wanted Webb to tell him exactly where his people were. Webb told him. Finch said, "We're going to get your people out, Captain." Not a reassurance. A statement of operational intent from someone who had the capability to back it up. Webb recognized the difference. "One of them is a medic," Webb said. "Specialist Sarah Calloway. She's been treating 2 wounded soldiers for 40 hours with multiple gunshot wounds to herself. Whatever your medical specialist is prepared for, prepare for more." A brief pause on the line. "Copy that," Finch said. Webb looked at the 50 meters of open ground between his position and the vehicle. He picked up his rifle and checked the chamber and waited. The SEAL team hit the ground at 0047. 2 helicopters simultaneous approaches from different vectors. The operators were on the ground and moving before the rotor wash had finished flattening the dust. Lieutenant Commander Garrett Finch moved through the city the way he had moved through a dozen cities before this one, reading the street in a language he had spent years learning. His team moved in the 2x2 pattern that put eyes in every direction, the pattern that had kept people alive across 2 decades of this kind of work. They made contact with 3 insurgent positions between the landing zone and Webb's location. The contacts were brief. Suppressed weapons, momentum, maintained the advance kept moving, because momentum was the only thing that kept the objective reachable. They reached Webb's position at 0112. Finch looked at the ground between Webb's position and the vehicle through his night optics. 4 seconds of hard assessment. 2 positions. North building, 2nd floor east window. Compound, rooftop, northwest corner. "I want both handled before anyone crosses that ground." 30 seconds, the pointman said. "Take 20. It took 18. "Move," Finch said. The pointman reached the overturned vehicle at 0119. He had been doing this work for 6 years and had reached positions where survivors should not have been survivors, people who had held on past the point where holding on made any biological sense. He came around the rear of the vehicle and looked through his night optics and was still for exactly 2 seconds. A woman lying on the road's surface, 11 visible wounds that he could assess in the available light, an improvised sling on her left arm, multiple pressure bandages applied with the precision of someone trained to apply them correctly, not improvised guesswork. A medical bag worked through to near depletion beside her. Her right hand was on the wrist of the soldier lying beside her. She was checking his pulse. He keyed his radio and said quietly, "I have eyes on the medic. She's still moving." A brief silence on the net, the kind of silence that meant something was being processed that the radio was not large enough to contain. Then Finch's voice, "Copy. Secure the position. Langford, get up there now." The pointman moved to her side and knelt and put his hand on her right arm gently with the specific quality of presence that communicated, "I am not a threat, and I am what you have been waiting for." She turned her head. Her eyes found his face through the darkness with a focus that surprised him. Not the eyes of someone mostly gone. The eyes of someone who had made a series of decisions and executed all of them and was now waiting to see what came next. Kowalski, she said, her voice was barely audible. Tourniquet right leg 42 hours. He needs surgery immediately. We have him, the appointment said. Harriet, head laceration, arm fracture, possible concussion. He's been stable. We have him too. She looked at him for one more moment. Okay, she said. Then she let her eyes close. Langford, the team's medical specialist, reached her position 40 seconds later and began his assessment with the speed of someone who had been told to prepare for more than expected and had prepared for considerably more than that and was still adjusting upward. He counted the wounds, found her airway, located the pulse in her right wrist thready and irregular, set a timer on his watch immediately. He looked at the two soldiers she had been treating. The tourniquet on Kowalski's leg properly positioned, properly tightened, showing the controlled management over time of someone who understood limb ischemia and had been preventing it deliberately. Harriet's arm immobilization. The systematic depletion of the medical bag. He made a note of what he was seeing in a place he could not access right now, but would be able to reach later in a quieter moment. Then he went to work. Finch coordinated the extraction with the precision of someone who understood that the margin between success and additional casualties lived in the seconds between decisions. Helicopters needed 4 minutes on the ground. The LZ was 2 streets over. 3 patients who could not move under their own power across terrain, still partially contested. He split his team. 6 operators established a corridor to the LZ. 4 operators moved the casualties with Langford directing. 2 stayed with the Webb's element and moved them simultaneously along a parallel route. Sarah was moved first. When they lifted her onto the litter, she made a sound that Finch heard from 5 meters away. He categorized it and continued running the extraction because continuing was the only thing that helped anyone, and the corridor needed to stay clean, and they were 30 seconds from the vehicle and 2 minutes from the LZ. She was on the helicopter in 3 minutes and 40 seconds from initial contact. Finch climbed on, last looked at his team, looked at the city below as the aircraft lifted and cleared the pilot to move. The flight to the hospital took 11 minutes. Langford worked on her for all of them with the calm and deliberate intensity of someone who understood that calm was not a luxury, but a tool that slower and more deliberate hands produced better outcomes than fast and urgent ones. She was unconscious for most of the flight. At minute 6, she came back. Her eyes open, found the ceiling, then Langford's face. Kowalski, she said. Is he? He's on the aircraft behind us, Langford said. Our medic has him. He's being handled. She looked at him for a moment. Harriet, she said, stable, he's going to make it. She was quiet. The aircraft banked and the light through the window shifted across her face. He hasn't named her yet, she said. Langford looked at her. Harriet's daughter, she said. He hasn't chosen a name. She needs a name. The effort of speaking was visible in the tightening around her eyes. He's going to be all right to tell her. Yes, Langford said, without qualification because it was true and because she needed it to be unqualified. He's going to be fine. She looked at the ceiling again. Okay, she said, her eyes closed. Dr. Nora Whitfield had been the lead trauma surgeon at the military hospital for 14 months. She had seen penetrating trauma from gunshot wounds on, she estimated, over 200 occasions. She had seen patients who had sustained multiple wounds. She had seen patients who had survived situations the clinical literature classified as non-survivable. She had not seen this. The surgical team worked for 18 hours. 6 surgeons across 3 shifts, maintaining continuity through a handoff protocol that Whitfield had written 2 years earlier and was now being used exactly as intended, each surgeon fully briefed on the preceding work before taking over the total picture, maintained even as the hands changed. The injuries were addressed in order of immediate lethality. Chest wound first, back wound second, hip third, both shoulder wounds sequentially in hours 4 and 5. Arm fracture stabilized at hour 7. The head wound, which had been the source of greatest initial concern, proved on imaging to be exactly what it had presented as in the field, a graze with no intracranial involvement. At hour 14, Whitfield stepped back from the table, let the next surgeon take the closing work and walked to the scrub room. She stood at the sink with the water running and looked at her hands. She was thinking about a finding made in the first minutes of surgery before the most urgent work began, while the team was still establishing the full picture of what they were dealing with. Kowalski had come into the operating room adjacent to Sarah's, his tourniquet still in place, his leg requiring immediate vascular surgery to address damage to the femoral artery that had been progressing for 42 hours. The vascular surgeon had assessed the tourniquet placement before removal. The tourniquet was a standard military belt, not a medical tourniquet, a piece of equipment repurposed by someone who knew what they were doing, placed at the correct anatomical position, tightened to the correct pressure, managed over time with the correct release intervals to prevent the irreversible tissue damage that improper extended tourniquet application caused. The tourniquet application was the only reason Kowalski had a viable leg to operate on. 42 hours of correct management with an improvised device had preserved tissue that would otherwise have been beyond saving. Her colleague in the adjacent operating room had said during the handoff briefing, "When did she place this? Do we know the timeline?" Whitfield had told him what the field assessment suggested, that Sarah Calloway had been shot in the back of the head approximately 14 hours before extraction, that she had been essentially paralyzed from the neck down for most of those 14 hours, that the tourniquet appeared to have been last adjusted sometime after the final bullet wound based on the blood evidence on the belt. Her colleague had looked at her for a long moment. "She placed it after the headshot," he said, "or adjusted it, or both, after the 11th wound." He looked down at Kowalski on his table, at the tourniquet, at the careful, deliberate placement that had kept this 22-year-old from losing his leg or his life. "Her hands knew what to do," Whitfield said, "even when everything else had stopped." She stood at the sink and considered what that meant, not as a metaphor, but as a physiological reality. Muscle memory was a clinical term describing the encoding of repeated physical actions into procedural memory at a level below conscious access, a level that persisted when higher cognitive function was compromised. It was not poetry, it was a neurological mechanism. But standing at that sink in a quiet hospital corridor, after 18 hours of surgery, she was having difficulty keeping it only clinical. She dried her hands and went back to work. 3 weeks later, at a general hospital in Germany, a letter arrived. It was handwritten in the slightly compressed script of someone who was not accustomed to writing by hand, but had decided this communication required it. The envelope had been sent through the military mail system with the patient determination of someone uncertain of the address but committed to finding it. Sarah read it in the bed, her right hand holding the paper, her left arm still in the formal cast that had replaced the improvised immobilization she had worn for 2 days on a Fallujah street. Douglas Harriet wrote that he was home, that he had arrived 3 weeks and 4 days after his scheduled date, which was the way he phrased most things in terms of the planned timeline and the actual timeline, the gap between them, a measure of something without a proper name. He wrote that his daughter was healthy and that she was as his wife had predicted loud. He wrote that she had a name. He wrote, "Her name is Sarah. My wife and I decided before I got home. I told her about the street, what I could tell her. She said the name without me asking. I think she understood the reason before I did." He wrote, "I don't know what to say that is large enough for what happened on that street. I've been trying to write this letter for 3 weeks, and I keep stopping because nothing I write sounds right. So I'll just say this, I've been a soldier for 12 years, and I have been in places where people did hard things under hard conditions. I have never seen anything like what you did. Not close. My daughter will know your name her whole life. I'll make sure of it." He wrote, "Come visit when you're well. My wife makes good coffee, and my daughter is already opinionated about most things, but I think she'd make an exception for you." He signed it Harriet. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it on the table beside the bed and looked at the window, which showed a gray November sky over the city below. A different sky from the one she had spent 2 days staring at. Lower, softer, without that particular quality of indifference the desert sky had carried. She sat with the letter for a while, then she picked up the pen from the table and started writing back. The Military Board of Inquiry convened 6 weeks after the ambush in a conference room at brigade headquarters at Camp Fallujah. Captain Marcus Webb sat at the witness table in his dress uniform and read from a prepared statement. He had written it himself, and he had written 4 versions of it over 3 weeks and discarded each one. Each discarded version had found ways, subtle ways to distribute the responsibility for what had happened across the intelligence chain, the operational environment, the inherent uncertainty of combat decision-making. Reasonable-sounding language that was accurate in its details and dishonest in its emphasis. He had discarded all 4 versions. The 5th version was the one he read. He described the intelligence package. He described the briefing. He described the moment Specialist Calloway had raised her hand and the exact words she had used and the specific basis for her assessment, which he enumerated completely and accurately because she had earned the right to have her analysis stated fully and on the official record. He described his response. He said Specialist Calloway identified the intelligence anomaly Bory at 0740 hours on the morning of the operation. She identified it correctly in terms that were specific and professionally grounded. I dismissed her assessment without adequate consideration. I proceeded with the operation on the basis of intelligence that she had correctly identified as suspect. The ambush that followed was a direct consequence of that decision. I am providing this statement because the record should reflect what happened accurately and because Specialist Calloway is entitled to have her judgment acknowledged in the official account of this operation. The room was quiet. A colonel at the end of the table said, "Captain Webb, the standard for intelligence assessment in that operational environment." "Sir," Webb said, "with respect, she was right and I was wrong. That is the relevant fact. I'd like to finish my statement." The colonel looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat back in his chair. "Proceed," he said. Webb read the rest of it without stopping. When he finished, he set the paper on the table and looked at the colonel at the end of the row and waited. The colonel looked back at him for a long moment. Then the colonel looked down at his own notes and wrote something. Whatever it was, he wrote it slowly and deliberately, as if the weight of it required that kind of care. Webb had done what he came to do. He folded his statement and put it in his breast pocket and sat with his hands flat on the table and waited for whatever came next. Fort Sam, Houston, Texas. A clear morning in late January. Cold by Texas standards, the air carrying the particular quality of a place that did not often have to manage cold and was doing so with mild reluctance. The ceremony was held on the parade ground, the kind of ceremony that required a specific quality of stillness, a formality that was not performance, but acknowledgement, the physical language of an institution, recognizing something it considered significant and did not have better language for than this: stand at attention, stand in formation, pin the medal, say the words. Sarah Calloway stood at attention in her dress uniform. She was still using a cane. The hip would take more time. The arm was fully functional. The shoulder was functional better on some mornings than others. The head wound had healed cleanly. She had been told by the rehabilitation team that her recovery was, in the language of their formal assessments, exceptional. She had not explained to them that exceptional had nothing to do with it, that she had not approached her recovery as something exceptional. She had approached it the way she approached everything. Check the inventory of what you have available, identify what needs to be done in what order, and begin. The general read the citation. She heard pieces of it, the formal language that described what had happened on a Fallujah street in November, the clinical summary of wounds sustained and soldiers treated in hours elapsed. It was accurate. It described what had happened. It did not describe what it had felt like to be inside it, but that was not what citations were for, and she did not expect it to be. She was thinking about Kowalski. He had called from Columbus 2 weeks ago, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who was somewhere they had not been certain they would get back to and was still slightly surprised to be there. His mother had been at the arrivals gate with a sign. Big letters, "Welcome home, dummy." He had laughed, telling her that the full laugh that carried across a motor pool, and she had laughed with him, and they had not needed to say anything else about it. She was thinking about Harriet and a baby girl in Montana who would grow up knowing a name and knowing the reason for it even before she was old enough to understand what reasons were. She was thinking about the briefing room, about the map on the wall, and the 12 soldiers in the folding chairs, and Webb's face as he set the question aside and moved on. She thought about this without anger, because the anger had never been what the situation required of her and still wasn't. She thought about it as a fact, one of the facts of that morning, one of the things that had happened and led to all the other things that had happened. She thought about her father's voice, low and unhurried. The voice that had made service sound like something that meant something. She understood now what he had understood. Not in the abstract, not as a principle stated in simple words, but in the specific, in the particular, in irreducible weight of it. That there was a version of yourself that existed beyond the point where you expected yourself to stop. That you did not find it until the situation required it, and then it was simply there, made of everything you had done up to that moment. Every morning you had checked the bag, every patient across 8 months of deployment, every lesson from every instructor, every conversation with every veteran who had talked about service as something that cost something and done it anyway. Her father's voice, Harriet's daughter's name, Kowalski's plane ticket folded in a breast pocket 72 hours from home, the right hand that had kept moving when nothing else could. The general pinned the silver star to her uniform. She stood at attention. When she turned, Webb was in the formation. She saw him before he saw her, standing with the rigid correctness of a man who had decided on a specific posture for this specific day and intended to hold it. His eyes were forward. Then they moved to her. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he came to a full formal salute. Not the casual acknowledgement between ranks. The full formal salute that the Army reserved for specific moments, the one that meant something beyond protocol, the one that required both the person giving it and the person receiving it to understand what it was for. He was a captain. She was a specialist. No regulation required it, and every convention argued against it. He held it. She returned it. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. She sat alone on a bench at the edge of the parade ground after the formation dissolved in the pale January light. Somewhere on the far side of the base, a training exercise was underway. Voices calling in sequence, the rhythm of people learning how to do something difficult before they needed to do it for real. She opened her wallet. The photograph was still there. The man in the service uniform taken the year before she was born. Slightly soft at the edges from years of handling, the image itself still clear. He was looking at the camera the way she imagined she looked at most things, with attention, with assessment, deciding whether to trust what she was seeing. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about what he had understood that she had not understood at 9 and had only begun to understand at 28 and was now understanding in a different way more completely through having paid for it. That service was not a quality you possessed. It was a series of decisions made in sequence, most of them small, none of them guaranteed to add up to anything, all of them necessary. The decision to check the bag a fourth time. The decision to raise your hand in a briefing room when you knew the answer was inconvenient. The decision to run into an open street towards someone who needed help, and then to keep running after the first bullet and the second and the 11. Her father had known this. He had known it in his body and his left knee that had carried a wound from the Korean Peninsula for the rest of his life, in the voice that talked about service the way you talked about something that had cost you something real and that you would choose again regardless. She had joined the army to understand what he understood. She closed the wallet and returned it to her pocket. She picked up the cane. She stood up slowly, stood straight in the January light, and looked at the parade ground where the formation had been, and was no longer where the flag moved in the cold and ordinary wind. She stood there for a long time the way you stood with something, when you were still in the early part of understanding it, when the understanding was still arriving, and you needed to stay still and let it. Then she walked off the parade ground one step at a time, unhurried in the direction of whatever came next.